My pension of $2,050 was no longer enough for me to live a normal life in Canada. At 73 years old, I sold almost everything I owned and moved to the Philippines. What happened there just 1 month later made me cry in the middle of a busy street. If you have a few minutes, please stay until the end of my story. My name is David. I'm 73 years old. I was born in Canada, and I spent my entire life there. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I would leave Canada forever and spend my retirement in the Philippines, I would have laughed. I would have said, no, that's impossible. I wasn't the kind of person who liked taking risks. I worked for more than 44 years as a railway maintenance technician. It wasn't glamorous work. Most people never noticed people like us. But every day before the first train left the station, my team made sure the tracks were safe. Rain, snow, freezing mornings, we were always there. I wasn't rich. I never owned a luxury home. I never drove an expensive car, but I believed in something my father taught me when I was a young man. If you work hard, save your money, and stay honest, you'll never have to worry when you're old. For most of my life, I believed he was right. Every month, I saved a little. I avoided unnecessary debt. I rarely bought expensive things, while my friends upgraded their cars every few years. I kept driving the same pickup truck for almost 16 years. People joked that I was too careful with money. Maybe I was. But I wasn't saving to become rich. I was saving because I wanted a peaceful retirement. I dreamed about quiet mornings, fishing once in a while, reading books, drinking coffee on my porch without worrying about work. Nothing fancy, just peace. Then life changed. My wife, Susan, passed away 5 years before I retired. Cancer. It all happened much faster than either of us expected. 1 year she was planting flowers in our garden. The next year, I was standing beside her grave. We had been married for 41 years. When you've spent 4 decades waking up beside the same person, you stop noticing how much of your life they have become. You don't think about it, until one morning, their side of the bed stays empty. That was the hardest part, not the funeral, not the hospital. The mornings afterward. For months, I still found myself making 2 cups of coffee. I'd catch myself asking, "Do you want toast?" Then I'd remember. There was no one there. People often say time heals everything. I don't think that's true. Time teaches you how to carry the pain. That's different. After Susan died, the house became unbelievably quiet. My daughter lived in British Columbia. My son had moved to Alberta years earlier. Both had families, both had careers, both called me every week. They always asked, "Dad, how are you doing?" And every single time, I gave them the same answer. "I'm doing fine." It was easier than telling them the truth. The truth was, most days, I barely spoke to anyone. Sometimes an entire day would pass without hearing my own voice. When I retired, I wasn't worried about money. My pension was around $2,050 a month. It sounded like enough. At least it used to, but every year, Canada became a little more expensive. Then, a little more. Then even more. Electricity, natural gas, property taxes, car insurance, groceries, prescription medicine, everything seemed to increase, except my pension. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I simply adjusted my budget. Then I started noticing little changes. Instead of buying steak, I bought ground beef. Instead of fresh salmon, I bought frozen fish. Instead of eating out once a week, I stopped going altogether. I told myself I was simply being responsible. But deep down, I knew something was changing. One cold afternoon, I drove to the supermarket like I always did. I walked through the produce section first. A small container of strawberries, almost $8. I smiled to myself, not because it was funny, because I honestly couldn't believe it. I picked them up, looked at the price again, then quietly put them back. Next came cheese. Too expensive. Then bacon, also too expensive. By the time I reached the checkout, my shopping cart looked almost empty. Milk, eggs, bread, oatmeal, frozen vegetables, coffee, that was it. The cashier smiled politely. "Did you find everything you needed today?" For a second, I wanted to answer honestly. No, but I simply smiled back. "Yes, thank you." When I arrived home, I carried the grocery bags into the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator, placed everything inside, then stood there looking at the shelves. The refrigerator wasn't completely empty, but it certainly didn't look like the refrigerator of someone who had worked for 44 years. I slowly closed the door, sat down at the kitchen table, and for the first time in many years, I cried. Not because of the groceries, because I felt embarrassed. Embarrassed that after working my entire life, I had to think twice before buying strawberries. That evening, I turned the thermostat down another 2 degrees. I put on an extra sweater, then another. Eventually, wearing 2 sweaters inside my own house became normal. Sometimes I even wore a winter hat while watching television. I laughed at myself, but it wasn't really funny. The heating bill kept getting higher, winter kept getting colder, and every month, my savings became a little smaller. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found another envelope. Another increase. This time, it was my home insurance. I didn't even seem surprised anymore. I simply placed the letter on the kitchen counter, made myself a cup of coffee, sat down, opened my notebook, and started writing. Pension, electricity, heating, insurance, property taxes, medicine, groceries, gasoline, phone, internet. I added every number twice, hoping I had made a mistake. I hadn't. When I reached the bottom of the page, there wasn't much left. Certainly not enough to enjoy retirement. I looked around my quiet kitchen. Then I quietly asked myself, is this really the life you worked so hard for? I already knew the answer. A few days later, something happened completely by accident. I was sitting in my living room watching YouTube. I don't even remember what I had searched for. Then one video appeared on my screen. The title said, "Why I Left Canada and Retired in the Philippines." Normally, I would have ignored it. Instead, I clicked. I had no idea that one simple click was about to change the rest of my life. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the video. It wasn't the beaches that caught my attention. It wasn't the sunshine. It wasn't even the lower cost of living. It was the man's face. He looked peaceful, not excited, not pretending, just peaceful. I realized something that made me uncomfortable. I couldn't remember the last time I had looked like that. The next morning, I watched another video, then another. Soon, it became part of my routine. Every evening after dinner, I made myself a cup of coffee, sat in my old recliner, and watched people talk about their lives in the Philippines. Some were Americans, some were Australians, some were from Germany, a few were Canadians. Different countries, different backgrounds, but they all seemed to say the same thing. I finally feel alive again. That sentence stayed with me. Alive again. Not richer, not younger. Alive. Over the next few weeks, I stopped watching television. Instead, I started researching. I looked up apartment prices, healthcare, electricity, food, transportation. I opened my calculator. Again and again, I compared my monthly expenses in Canada with what other retirees said they spent in the Philippines. At first I thought they were exaggerating. Surely life couldn't be that affordable. So I checked another website. Then another. The numbers were surprisingly similar. For the first time in months, I felt curious instead of worried. One afternoon, I found myself looking at pictures of small cafes, fresh fruit markets, people sitting outside talking to each other. It looked different. Not perfect, but different. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, I got out of bed. I walked into the kitchen, made another cup of coffee. Then I grabbed a yellow notebook from the drawer. At the top of one page, I wrote 2 words. Stay. Leave. Understay. I wrote everything I could think of. My house, my memories, my children's visits, my doctor's office, my favorite fishing spot, the neighborhood I had known for decades. Then I looked at the other side. For a long time, I couldn't think of anything. Finally, I wrote one word: hope. I stared at that word for several minutes. It looked so small on the page. Yet somehow, it felt bigger than everything on the other side. A few days later, I decided to tell my children. I called my son first. Dad, you're joking. No, you actually want to move to the Philippines. I've been thinking about it. There was a long silence. Finally, he said, You're 73. I know, you don't know anyone there. I know. What if something happens? I didn't have an answer, because I had been asking myself the same question every night. The next day, I called my daughter. She sounded even more surprised. Dad, why so far away? I don't know. You don't know. I smiled. I only know that I don't want to spend the rest of my life feeling the way I do now. She became very quiet. I just don't want to lose you. You won't, but you'll be on the other side of the world. I'll still answer every phone call. She laughed softly, then I heard her crying. I just wish Mum were here. So do I. We both stayed silent for a while. Sometimes, silence says more than words ever could. Over the next week, I almost changed my mind 3 different times. I'd wake up feeling excited. By evening, I'd convince myself it was a terrible idea. One moment I imagined warm mornings and fresh starts. The next, I imagined getting sick in a country where I knew no one. Fear has a way of making every dream sound impossible. Then something happened that forced me to make a decision. One Friday morning, I opened my mailbox. Inside was another white envelope. I almost left it there. When I finally opened it, my heart sank. My property taxes were increasing again. I carried the letter into the kitchen, pulled out my notebook, and started calculating. Pension, heating, electricity, insurance, grocery, medicine, taxes, everything. I checked the numbers twice, then a third time. The result never changed. If I stayed in Canada, I would spend the next several years watching my savings slowly disappear. Not because I was living extravagantly, but simply because I was growing older. I looked around my kitchen, the same table, the same refrigerator, the same clock on the wall. Everything suddenly felt heavy. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery. I hadn't visited Susan in several weeks. I stood quietly beside her headstone. The wind was cold. Snow covered the grass. I brushed a little snow away with my glove. Then I smiled. You always said I worried too much. For a moment, I imagined what she might have said. David, stop being afraid. I laughed to myself. Then I whispered something I never thought I would say. I think I'm going to leave Canada. The cemetery remained silent. But somehow, I felt lighter. When I arrived home, I didn't sit down. I didn't overthink it. I picked up my phone, searched for the number I had saved a few days earlier. Then I pressed the call button. A cheerful voice answered. Good afternoon, Maple Leaf Realty. I took a deep breath. My name is David. I think it's time to sell my house. As soon as those words left my mouth, I knew my life had already begun to change. The real estate agent came to my house the very next afternoon. Her name was Karen. She had been selling homes for more than 20 years. She walked slowly from room to room, taking pictures and making notes. When she finished, she smiled. You've taken very good care of this house. I looked around the living room. I've tried. What I really wanted to say was, this house took good care of me. 3 days later, the listing went online. The phone started ringing almost immediately. Young couples, retired couples, families with children. People came almost every day. Each time someone walked through my front door, I felt a strange feeling inside my chest. It was as if complete strangers were walking through my memories. One Saturday afternoon, a young family came to see the house. 2 little boys ran upstairs laughing. Their mother apologized. I'm so sorry, I smiled. It's okay. As I listened to their footsteps, I closed my eyes for just a moment. I could almost hear my own children running through that same hallway 40 years earlier. For a few seconds, the house felt alive again. When I opened my eyes, they were gone. Only strangers remained. A week later, Karen called. We have an offer. I didn't ask how much. Instead, I asked one question. Do they seem like a nice family? She laughed softly. They do, I smiled. Then let's do it. The paperwork was signed 2 days later. Just like that. 40 years of my life officially belonged to someone else. That evening, I walked slowly through every room. The kitchen, the dining room, the living room, the garage. I touched the walls, opened the closets one last time, looked out every window. It felt as though I was saying goodbye to an old friend. Packing turned out to be much harder than I expected. Not because there were so many things, because almost everything reminded me of someone. An old fishing rod my father had given me, Susan's favorite coffee mug, a box filled with birthday cards from my children, photo albums, Christmas ornaments, letters. 40 years cannot fit inside one suitcase. Eventually, I stopped asking, what should I take? Instead, I asked, what can I let go? That was much harder. A few days before my flight, my daughter came to visit. She walked into the house and looked around. Most of the furniture was already gone. It feels so empty. It does. We spent the afternoon packing the last few boxes. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes we didn't say anything at all. That evening, she looked at me and asked, Dad, are you scared? I smiled, very. Then why are you still going? I thought about that question for a long time. Finally I answered, because I'm even more afraid of staying. She looked at me for several seconds. Then she hugged me. I'm going to miss you. I'm going to miss you too. The next morning, my son called. I wish I could be there. I know. I still think you're crazy. I laughed. You've told me that 3 times already. I know. There was a short silence. Then his voice changed. But I hope this makes you happy. So do I. The day before I left, I drove to the cemetery one last time. The snow had started falling again. I stood in front of Susan's grave. I'll be gone for a while. The wind gently moved through the trees. I wish you could see this. I smiled. You probably think I'm crazy too. For some reason, that made me laugh. Before leaving, I placed a small white flower beside her headstone. I'll always love you. Then I turned around. That was the last time I saw that cemetery. The following morning, I stood inside Toronto Pearson Airport with one large suitcase and one backpack. That was all I owned now. Everything else had been sold, donated, or given away. As I waited to board my flight, I looked around the terminal. People were flying on vacations, business trips, family visits. I was flying toward a completely different life. When the airplane finally took off, I looked out the window. Canada slowly disappeared beneath the clouds. I whispered to myself, thank you. Not because I wanted to leave, because I was grateful for the life I had lived there. 16 hours later, the captain announced our arrival in Manila. My heart started beating faster. When the airplane door opened, warm air rushed inside. It felt completely different from Canada. The airport was noisy. People were everywhere. Different languages, different faces, different smells. Everything was unfamiliar. For a moment, I wanted to turn around. I wanted to get back on the plane. I wanted my old life again. Even with all its problems, fear can make familiar pain seem safer than unfamiliar hope. After collecting my luggage, I found a taxi. The driver smiled. First time in the Philippines. Sir. Yes, he nodded happily. You'll like it here. I smiled politely. I hope so. The drive to my apartment felt overwhelming. Motorcycles passed us from every direction. Street vendors cooked food beside the road. Families sat outside their homes talking and laughing. Children played basketball in narrow streets. Everything seemed busy. Everything seemed alive. When we finally arrived at my apartment, I thanked the driver and carried my suitcase upstairs. The apartment was much smaller than my house in Canada. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a tiny balcony. I sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time since arriving, the silence hit me. What have you done, David? I looked around the unfamiliar room. Nothing looked familiar. Nothing smelled familiar. Nothing sounded familiar. That night, I barely slept. I seriously thought about booking a flight back to Canada. I believed I had made the biggest mistake of my life. But the next morning, I got lost while trying to buy a bottle of water. And that simple mistake led me to meet someone who completely changed the way I saw the Philippines. Looking back now, I honestly believe that getting lost was the best thing that could have happened to me.